The day Jasper Sullivan finally met the woman who owned every acre of earth beneath his boots, he was standing in the ranch kitchen doorway asking her if she had any more of that cornbread left. It was the autumn of 1883, and the Talmadge spread sat like a crown jewel in the hill country of central Texas, sprawling across 4,000 acres of golden grassland, oak-shaded creek bottoms, and limestone ridges that turned amber in the late afternoon light. The cattle were fat, the fences were mostly sound, and Jasper Sullivan had spent the better part of 6 years believing the whole enterprise belonged to a man named Edmund Talmadge, a name he had only ever encountered at the bottom of a lease agreement that arrived once a year by post from an attorney's office in San Antonio. He had never met Edmund Talmadge. He had never felt the need to. The lease terms were fair, better than fair, honestly, and the land worked so well that Jasper had built his whole life around it, hiring on 3 hands, running close to 300 head of longhorn, and slowly turning himself from a drifting cowboy with nothing but a horse and a bedroll into something resembling a legitimate cattleman. He paid his annual lease on time every November, received a brief note of receipt from the attorney's office, and that was the sum total of his relationship with the person whose name was on the deed. Which was why, when a wagon rolled through his gate on a Tuesday morning in October carrying a woman and her luggage, he assumed she was the new cook's assistant. He needed one badly. His cook, a cranky but capable man named Hector Beale, had been complaining for 2 months that he could not manage the meals alone now that the ranch had grown, and Jasper had quietly put the word out in town. He had expected a plain woman of middling years, perhaps a widow in need of work. What rolled up on that wagon was something else entirely. She was 28 years old, though Jasper did not know that yet. She sat straight-backed on the wagon bench beside old Clem Purdy, the livery driver from Caldwell who hauled goods and people out to the outlying ranches. She wore a practical dark blue traveling dress that had collected a fine layer of dust at its hem, and her hair, dark brown shot through with hints of copper where the sun found it, was pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat that a woman with less confidence might not have carried off. She had a composed, watchful face. Not cold, composed. There was a difference, though Jasper did not think about that distinction right away because he was still thinking about the cook's assistant situation. He walked over to the wagon as Clem drew the horses to a stop, touching the brim of his own hat in greeting. He was 32, lean and sun-darkened, with a jaw that had not met a razor in 4 days and a permanently faded bruise of dust along the knees of his trousers. 6 years of leasing that land had given him a sense of ease on it, the kind of ease that comes when a man moves through a place every single day and begins to absorb the particular rhythms of its soil and its sky. "Morning," he said. "You hear about the cook position?" She looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in her expression, not offense exactly, but something quieter and more measured. "Not precisely," she said. Her voice was low and even, with a slight formality to it that spoke of education. "She come down from San Antonio," old Clem supplied helpfully, already beginning to climb down from the bench. "Got a pile of luggage in the back. Felt important." Jasper glanced at the luggage, 2 traveling trunks and a leather satchel. It was more than a cook's assistant would bring. He supposed she might be a housekeeper, though he had not advertised for one of those either. He had a woman named Mrs. Farrow who came from town twice a week to see to the house, and she managed fine. "I should introduce myself properly," the woman said, and climbed down from the wagon with a neat economy of movement that suggested she had climbed in and out of wagons quite a few times and did not require assistance, though she was perfectly aware he had not offered any. "My name is Delia Talmadge." The name landed on him strangely, the way a sound sometimes does when you hear it in a context where it has no business being, like hearing your own name called in a crowded street and not being sure whether someone spoke it or you imagined it. Talmadge. He looked at her more carefully then. She was watching him with those calm, dark eyes, and there was the faintest suggestion of something in her expression that might have been curiosity about how he would handle the next 10 seconds. Edmund Talmadge's daughter, he asked, because it was the only thing that made sense to him right at that moment. Edmund Talmadge's niece, she said. He passed away in February. He left this property to me. I believe you have been leasing it from him and now from me as of this past March, when the estate was settled. She paused. I apologize for not writing ahead to introduce myself. I felt it was better done in person. Jasper Sullivan stood in the October sun in front of the house he had essentially built from a wreck into something livable, looking at the woman who owned every inch of ground he was standing on, and for a long and thoroughly undignified moment he said nothing at all. Then he said, "Would you like some water? You must have had a long ride." It was not eloquent. It was not even particularly gracious. But Delia Talmadge looked at him for a moment, and something about her composed expression softened, just fractionally, and she said that yes, she would like some water very much. Hector Beale was not pleased about any of it, which was how Jasper first discovered that he had made a mistake. He found Hector in the kitchen 20 minutes later and asked him to fix something for the new arrival, explaining who she was, and Hector set down his wooden spoon with a clatter and said, "She owns this place. I thought you owned this place." "I lease it," Jasper said, with a patience he did not entirely feel. "For 6 years you have leased it. 6 years, Sullivan. That is practically owning it. It is not even slightly owning it." Hector muttered something under his breath and picked his spoon back up. "Did you at least apologize for thinking she was here to peel potatoes?" Jasper considered this. "Not directly." "Lord have mercy," Hector said to the ceiling. He went back to the front room of the house, which he had done his best to make presentable over the years, a good rug, a table that did not wobble, curtains that Mrs. Farrow had sewn and rehung twice, because Jasper kept pulling them down to use as horse blankets in emergencies, and then forgetting to replace them. Delia Talmadge was standing at the window, looking out at the pasture where his cattle grazed, and the afternoon light came through the glass and turned the copper in her hair to something that deserved better description than he was capable of at present. "I owe you an apology," he said from the doorway. She turned. "For which part?" "For asking if you were here about the cook's assistant position." She considered him for a moment. "It is a reasonable mistake. I arrived without announcement on a working ranch. I might have been anyone." "You might have been," he agreed. "But you weren't." There was a pause that was not exactly uncomfortable, but was charged with a kind of mutual assessment, the way two animals in an unfenced field take stock of each other before deciding what to do. "I want to be clear about something," Delia said, turning back to the window for a moment and then back to him. "I did not come out here to disrupt your operation. My uncle's attorney, Mr. Graves, was in favor of simply renewing the lease and leaving things as they are. The terms are fair and the land is clearly well managed." She glanced out the window again at the cattle, at the clean-cut fence posts, at the windmill turning slowly above the stock tank. "But Edmund left me this land, Mr. Sullivan. He was the only family I had left, and this place was the last thing he gave me. I needed to see it myself." Jasper leaned against the doorframe. He had not expected that kind of directness or that kind of feeling behind it. He had expected, he was not sure what he had expected, something more transactional maybe. "Your uncle never came out to see it himself," he said. "Not once in 6 years as far as I know. Edmund was not in good health for the last several years. He managed everything through Mr. Graves." She paused. "He spoke of this land often, though. He bought it when he was young, before things got difficult for him. He always meant to come out." There was something in the way she said it, the particular weight of intentions that had run out of time, that made the room feel slightly different. Jasper looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the grief under the composure. It was not on the surface, not performing itself for him, but it was there, quiet and real. "Then I am glad you came," he said, and he meant it. She looked at him then, and something shifted between them, something that neither of them named or acknowledged, but that was there, sitting in the light between the two of them like a third presence in the room. "You could take the guest room," Jasper offered. "Mrs. Farrow comes Thursday. She will see to it that you are comfortable." "I appreciate it. I plan to stay for a few weeks if that is acceptable. I want to understand what I have." "I will show you everything," he said. He meant the land. He was entirely sure he meant the land. He was less sure by the end of the week. Delia Talmadge was not what Jasper had expected a landowner from San Antonio to be. She was not soft or uninterested. She rose earlier than he did, which was early enough that the sky was still more gray than blue, and she was already at the corral fence when he came out to start the morning's work, her hat on and her coffee in her hand, watching his horses with an eye that knew what it was looking at. "That bay mare is favoring her left foreleg," she said by way of morning greeting on the second day. He had noticed the same thing the previous afternoon. "I had Hank look at it yesterday. She caught something in the hoof. He got it out. She is still stepping a little light on it. Should be fine in another day or two." Delia nodded and sipped her coffee. She did not make a performance of her knowledge or rub it in. She stated what she saw, and if he had already addressed it, she acknowledged it and moved on. He found that he appreciated this more than he had a language for, having spent years with men who either wanted to argue about everything or who deferred too completely and offered nothing useful. On the third day, he took her out on horseback to see the full extent of the property. The east pastures along the creek, where the best grass grew thick and green even in autumn. The limestone ridge country to the north, where the cattle grazed in summer. The lower fields where he had been thinking about putting in some winter feed crops if the lease was renewed long-term. She rode well, with the easy balance of someone who had grown up with horses, and she asked intelligent questions about carrying capacity and water sources and the condition of the north fence line, which needed work. He told her honestly that the north fence was his next project, that he had budgeted for it in his autumn accounts. She listened, and he had the strange experience of justifying his ranch decisions to someone who was neither a business partner nor a rival, but who had a legitimate stake in every choice he made, and who was listening with what seemed like genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. "You have done well with it," she said, near midday, when they had stopped to water the horses at the creek. The water ran clear and quick over flat limestone shelves, and the live oaks arched overhead, dropping yellow leaves into the current. "This is good grass, good water." Edmund would have been pleased. Jasper loosened his horse's girth and let the animal drink. "I have put a lot into it," he said. "Not just work. I mean, it started to feel like mine, I suppose. I know it is not." She looked at him steadily. "The feeling and the fact are different things. I know that. I am not criticizing the feeling," she said. "I think any man who works a piece of land as thoroughly as you have worked this one would feel that way. I am only noting that they are different." He looked at her. The creek made its small, constant sound. A kingfisher arrowed past, bright as an omen. "What will you do with it?" he asked. "If you don't mind me asking." She was quiet for a moment. The horses drank. The yellow leaves fell. "I am not sure yet," she said. "That is partly why I am here." The truth of what was happening between them came on slowly, the way weather comes across the Texas hill country, gradual and then, all at once, impossible to ignore. There was the evening of the fourth day, when a blue norther blew through and dropped the temperature 20 degrees in an hour, and they ended up sitting together at the kitchen table after supper, while the wind howled outside, playing cards with Hector's greasy deck, because the hands had their own bunkhouse, and it was too cold to walk back to it for a book. Delia had sharp, quick instincts at cards, and she beat him twice, which he found he enjoyed rather than resented. There was the morning of the seventh day, when they rode out to the north fence and discovered that the situation was worse than he had thought, several posts down entirely, and a stretch of wire that had to be completely replaced, and she had helped him unload the supplies from the wagon and hand him tools without being asked, and they had worked alongside each other in the cold, clear morning air with an ease that felt like something they had always done. There was the afternoon of the 10th day, when Mrs. Pharaoh arrived and took an immediate and visible shine to Delia and proceeded to tell her, at length and in generous detail, what a good and reliable man Jasper Sullivan was, which was embarrassing for Jasper, and which Delia received with an expression of careful neutrality that he found, for some reason, extremely appealing. "She means well," he said afterward, when Mrs. Pharaoh had gone to see about the linen and they were standing on the porch watching the late sun. "She clearly adores you," Delia said. "She adores anyone who pays on time and does not make more mess than she can clean. I do not think that is entirely what she adores." There was a warmth in her voice, careful and contained, like an ember keeping its own counsel. Jasper looked at her profile in the last light, the straight nose, the clean line of her jaw, the way she held herself as though she had been making her own decisions for a long time and expected to keep doing so, and he felt something move in his chest that he had not felt in years, if he had ever felt it quite this way. He did not say anything about it. It was too soon, or he was too cautious, or both. But he noticed it, and he stored it somewhere close to the center of himself, where he would know where to find it later. The complication came on the 14th day. His name was Roland Fitch, and he arrived mid-morning on a horse that cost more than most men earned in a year, with a pair of well-dressed associates, and the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having needed to work very hard for anything. He was perhaps 45, broad-shouldered and heavy-jowled, and he represented a cattle company out of Austin that had been making inquiries about buying up land in the county. Jasper had heard of him. He had also heard that Fitch's methods of acquisition could be described, generously, as aggressive. Fitch had not known, apparently, that Delia was at the ranch. He had come expecting to deal with whatever agent or attorney managed the Talmadge property. Instead, he found her standing on the porch drinking her morning coffee when he rode in, and the look that crossed his face was that of a man recalculating rapidly. Jasper was at the corral when the riders came through the gate, and he walked over to see what the business was, arriving at the porch just as Fitch was introducing himself to Delia and offering her his broadest smile. "Miss Talmadge," Fitch was saying, "what a genuine pleasure. I had no idea the property had been inherited by someone, so I had expected a man of affairs." "A man of affairs," Delia repeated pleasantly. "I represent the Lone Star Land and Cattle Company. We have been making inquiries about properties in this county, and yours has attracted our interest. We would be prepared to make you a very generous offer." "I am not interested in selling," Delia said, equally pleasantly. Fitch's smile did not dim. "I wonder if you have heard the figure we are prepared to put on the table. Land values in this county are unlikely to be this strong again. The railroad is coming through to the north, but the speculation has been beneficial for current holders. I would not want you to miss the best possible moment." "I appreciate the consideration," Delia said, "but I am not interested in selling at present." "Perhaps after you have reviewed the numbers," Fitch suggested. "I could send them along to your attorney. Mr. Graves is my attorney, and I will instruct him accordingly. Good morning, Mr. Fitch." It was a clean, courteous dismissal. Fitch received it with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes, and he looked past Delia at Jasper with an appraising expression that Jasper did not particularly like. "Sullivan," Fitch said, as though the name tasted of something mildly unpleasant. "I know your name. You have been running cattle on this land for some time. Perhaps you might speak to Miss Talmadge about the merits of—" "Miss Talmadge seems to have spoken to herself just fine," Jasper said. "I respect the answer." Fitch took a moment, the smile gone now. Then he touched his hat to Delia, turned his horse, and rode away with his associates at his heels. Delia watched them go. She was quiet for a moment after the sound of hooves faded. "He will come back," Jasper said. "I expect he will. He has a reputation for wearing people down. He has made some ugly messes in the county." She turned and looked at him. "Are you worried about me?" "A little," he admitted. "He is not a man who takes no for an answer gracefully." She considered this. "I have dealt with men who do not take no for an answer before, Mr. Sullivan. It is not entirely new territory." "I know you have." He paused. "But you should know that I will back you up. If it comes to anything uncomfortable, I mean, you should not have to handle it alone." The look she gave him was thoughtful and warm and direct, all three at once in a way that hit him squarely. "Thank you," she said. It was simply said without performance, and that made it hit harder. Fitch was back 4 days later, this time riding onto the property without announcement in the late afternoon, while Jasper was out in the east pasture with his hands seeing to a section of fence. He came back to find that Fitch had been at the house, and Delia had received him a second time, and dismissed him a second time, and that he had, in parting, made a comment about how a woman alone, managing a property of this size without family or a husband, to advise her was in a precarious position, and that his offer was an act of generosity she should not be too proud to accept. Jasper heard this from Hector, who had witnessed the exchange from the kitchen doorway, and who reported it with visible outrage. He found Delia at the desk in what had been Edmund Talmadge's study, a small room off the front hall that was now functionally hers, though it still had an impersonal quality, books she had not chosen and maps she had not drawn, and she was writing a letter with a steady hand. "Hector told me," he said from the doorway. "I assumed he would." She did not look up from her letter. "What he said was not, I know what it was," she said, still writing. "It was meant to be undermining. It wasn't." She set down her pen and looked at him, and he saw that she was not upset, not rattled, but that there was something harder and more crystalline in her expression than usual. "I grew up in San Antonio, Mr. Sullivan. My father died when I was 12. My mother died when I was 19. Edmund Talmadge helped me as much as he could, but he was in a different city and not in good health. I have been managing my own affairs, making my own decisions, negotiating my own position in the world for a considerable number of years. A man on a good horse saying condescending things does not change my arithmetic." Jasper was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I wasn't going to suggest you were rattled." "What were you going to suggest?" "That you should let me write to the sheriff's office in Caldwell, not because you cannot handle Fitch. Because he has a history of making trouble when he does not get what he wants, and it does not hurt to have the law informed." She looked at him for a long moment. Then her expression softened, and something in her shoulders settled, not in defeat, but in a different kind of relief. "That is a reasonable suggestion," she said. "I have them occasionally." She looked at him for another moment, and the ghost of a smile moved across her face, and he felt the heat of it from across the room. He wrote to the sheriff. He received a reply within the week confirming that Fitch was indeed known to the office and that his presence in the area was noted. In the meantime, Delia Talmadge stayed. She had said a few weeks, and the few weeks stretched, and she did not seem in any hurry to leave, and Jasper found himself actively grateful for this in a way that he examined carefully, because he was not a man who had much practice with the examination of his own feelings, and he wanted to be precise about what he was discovering. He was in love with her. He was fairly sure he had been falling in love with her since about the 5th day, though it had taken him considerably longer than the 5th day to admit this to himself. He was in love with her steadiness and her intelligence and her particular kind of practical courage, and the way she held her coffee cup with both hands in the cold mornings, and the way she laughed when Hector said something outrageous at the supper table, a real laugh, not a polite one that came from somewhere genuine and warm. He was also aware, with an uncomfortable clarity, of the precise nature of the obstacle. She owned this land. He leased it. That was the fundamental fact, and it created a dynamic that made his feelings for her into something complicated, because he could not simply tell her how he felt without the shadow of the lease falling over the conversation. Would she wonder whether he was courting the land as much as the woman? Would she think his feelings were a strategy? He would have wondered it in her position. This uncertainty kept him careful and slightly formal in her company, even as the warmth between them grew daily in unmistakable ways. He thought she noticed the restraint. He thought she possibly understood the reason for it. She was too perceptive not to. The crisis arrived on a cold Thursday morning in early November. It came in the form of a second rider on a good horse. though this one rode in openly and dismounted politely and introduced himself as Mr. Chester Graves, attorney at law, San Antonio, arriving to discuss the renewal of the lease agreement and certain other matters that required Miss Talmadge's attention in person. Chester Graves was a narrow, careful man of 50-something, with a gray mustache and the permanently weary expression of a man who has spent his career managing other people's complicated situations. He had been Edmund Talmadge's attorney and was now Delia's, and he clearly regarded the entire arrangement. The woman, the leasing cowboy, the Texas Hill Country in November, with the resigned professionalism of someone who was simply going to see it all through regardless. Graves had brought with him, in a leather folder, several documents. The lease renewal was among them, but there was also, as it turned out, a complication that had not been previously communicated. Jasper sat at the kitchen table across from Graves and Delia, and listened as Graves explained, in his careful attorney's language, that a lien had been placed on the Talmadge property during the period of Edmund Talmadge's illness by a creditor in San Antonio, a debt Edmund had incurred during the difficult final years of his life, and that this lien had come due in December. The sum was not ruinous, but it was significant enough that it required attention. Graves had been managing it, but the creditor was pressing, and the simplest resolution would be to sell a portion of the land. "How much?" Delia asked. Her voice was even, but Jasper could hear the thinness behind it. Graves named a figure. Then he named the portion of land he had in mind, the Eastern Creek bottom section, perhaps 400 acres of the best ground on the property. The East Creek bottom was where Jasper's best grass was. It was where he watered his cattle. If that section was sold, the practical impact on his operation would be severe. But that was not what struck him most when he looked at Delia. What struck him was the way her hands were folded on the table, very still, and the way her jaw was set, and the small, controlled brightness of her eyes that told him she had not known about this, not the full extent of it, and that the news had just taken something from her. She had come out here because this land was the last thing her uncle had left her. And now the last thing her uncle had left her was arriving with a debt attached to it that threatened to take its best piece away. He did not think about it for very long. He thought about it for approximately long enough to do the arithmetic in his head, which he did quickly because he had always been good with numbers and because he had been carefully saving for 6 years with the intention of eventually buying land of his own. "I can cover it," he said. Both of them looked at him. "The debt," he said. "I have the savings. I have been putting money aside for years with the intention of buying land. I would like to propose something." Graves looked at him with the expression of a man who has seen stranger things in his career, but is remaining professionally neutral. Delia looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read, but which contained more than he could enumerate right now. "What are you proposing?" she asked. He had not worked out the full shape of it yet, but he knew the outline. "I pay the debt. We work out a revised lease agreement, one that is more formal, longer term, that gives me a defined path to potentially purchasing a portion of the property if I choose, at fair market value, over a period of years. No selling off the creek bottom to strangers. No piece of this land going to someone like Fitch." He paused. "The land stays yours. You keep the deed. I keep running my operation. Formalize what we already have, which has been working for 6 years." There was a silence in the kitchen. The fire in the stove crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the live oaks. "Why would you do that?" Delia asked, quietly, carefully. He looked at her. He was going to say something practical and sensible about the value of the land and the convenience of the existing arrangement. He started to say it. Then he stopped. He said the truth instead. "Because you came out here to keep this land," he said. "Because your uncle left it to you, and you loved him, and this is the last thing he gave you, and I am not going to sit here and watch it get picked apart for a debt that can be solved." He held her gaze. "And because over the last several weeks I have come to want very much for things to go well for you. That is an honest statement, and I understand if it complicates matters, but it is the honest one." The silence that followed that statement was the longest of his life, or felt like it. Graves was looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a man practicing very hard not to be present. Delia Talmadge looked at Jasper Sullivan with those clear, steady, dark eyes, and her expression went through several things that were too quick and too complicated for him to catalog. And then she said, "I think Mr. Graves should step outside for a few minutes." Graves was up and out the door with admirable efficiency. She looked at Jasper across the table. The fire crackled. The wind moved outside. Somewhere distant, one of his cattle made a long, low sound. "I want you to understand something," she said. "I came out here to look at land. I came here because I had nothing left of Edmund but this, and I needed to see what it was. I was prepared for an empty contract, a disinterested cowboy who would barely give me the time of day, a transaction." She paused. "I was not prepared for you." He was very still. "I was not prepared for someone who knew every post and rock on this property as well as I had hoped to know it myself someday. I was not prepared for someone who got up before sunrise and fixed things before they needed to be asked about. I was not prepared for—" She stopped. She looked at her own hands on the table for a moment. "I was not prepared to feel, in a matter of weeks, that this was a place I did not want to leave. That is a new sensation for me, Mr. Sullivan. It requires some careful navigation." "Jasper," he said. "My name is Jasper." She looked up at him, the ghost of that smile again, warmer this time. "Jasper," she said, "I would like to accept your offer." "The financial arrangement. Mr. Graves can draw up the paperwork." "And the other thing?" he asked. He could hear his own heart. "The other thing," she said. "I would like to navigate that carefully if you are patient." "I have been patient 6 years without even knowing what I was being patient about," he said. "I can manage a little more." She laughed at that, the real laugh from somewhere genuine, and it went through him like sunlight. Graves came back in when called, received the news of the arrangement with profound relief that he expressed as mild professional satisfaction, and spent the next 2 hours going over documents. Jasper's savings were sufficient to cover the debt. Graves would handle the creditor in San Antonio. A new and significantly more detailed lease agreement was to be drafted and sent for signature within the month. The East Creek bottom would remain intact. When Graves left the following morning, Jasper felt as though something in the world had realigned, not dramatically, not violently, but with the deep, solid click of things settling into their correct positions. November deepened, and the leaves went from yellow to brown, and the air acquired the particular cold clarity of Texas hill country autumn. Delia showed no indication of leaving, and Jasper showed no indication of wanting her to, and the ranch went on doing what a ranch in November does, the cattle being moved to protected pastures, the fence work being finished, the firewood being laid in, the preparations for winter being made with the methodical care of people who know that the land will need them to be ready. They rode out together most mornings. He showed her things she had not seen on that first circuit, the exact spot on the South Ridge where you could watch the sunset turn the hills purple and orange, the ancient pecan grove in the southeast corner that bore so heavily in good years that the branches bent with the weight of it, the place along the creek where the water deepened into a still pool and bass lay in the shadows below the surface. She told him things too. She told him about growing up in San Antonio, in a city that was already changing fast, that was growing and trading its older Spanish character for something newer and louder. She told him about her father, who had been a surveyor and had walked her over a great deal of Texas ground before he died, teaching her how to read land, how to understand the lay of it. She told him about the years after her mother died, when she had worked as a schoolteacher because it was steady, and because she was good at it, and because she had needed something to be good at. She told him about Edmund, his humor, his wide-ranging kindness, his frustration at his own failing health, his stories of the land in Texas that he had bought young and never quite made it out to see. "He described it to me often," she said. He could describe it in detail because the surveyor's reports were so thorough and he had a good imagination. He made it sound like a paradise. "Is it?" Jasper asked. She looked out over the south ridge, where the evening light was doing everything the light in this country does when it is at its best. "Yes," she said, "it rather is." He was not going to rush anything. He had meant what he said about patience, and he was aware that they were navigating something delicate, the intertwined complications of the practical and the personal, the land and the feeling, and he did not want to get it wrong. But there was a Wednesday evening in mid-November when everything became clear, and there was no longer any practical purpose to caution. It was cold, properly cold, the kind of cold that finds the gaps in the walls. They had been at the kitchen table for hours after supper, going over the property maps and discussing the spring plans. He had been thinking about expanding the cattle operation slightly, and she had been interested in the possibility of a kitchen garden and some fruit trees along the south wall of the house, and they had gotten into a long and genuinely enjoyable argument about where exactly the garden should go, which had moved from the maps to a disagreement about soil drainage, which had moved to the two of them standing at the kitchen window in the dark trying to point out to each other, by pointing at the dark, where the drainage line ran. It was absurd, and they both knew it was absurd, and the absurdity of it made her laugh again, that real laugh, and she turned from the window and she was very close to him, and the laughter faded into something else. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Delia," he said. "I have been waiting," she said, "for you to stop being so careful." He kissed her there in the cold kitchen with the wind pressing at the windows and the fire burning low in the stove. She kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything, and he felt the last of the careful distance between them dissolve like frost in the first real warmth. When they parted, he kept his hands on her face and looked at her, this woman who had appeared on a wagon 3.5 weeks ago and who had, without the slightest intention of doing so, completely rearranged the landscape of his heart. "I want to say something to you," he said. "I have been turning it over for weeks, trying to get it right." "Say it," she said. "What I feel for you is not about this land. I need you to know that. I know how it looks, the man who leases the property falling for the woman who owns it. I know how that could be read. But it is not that. What I feel for you would be exactly what it is if you had ridden up here in a perfectly ordinary wagon with no connection to this place at all." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him in the firelight. "I know that," she said. "I knew it before you said it." "How did you know?" "Because the way you looked at me when I told you Edmund left me this land, it was not calculation. It was just you, surprised and then kind." She touched his jaw just briefly with the back of her fingers. "I am a good judge of character, Jasper Sullivan. I was the school teacher, remember. I had to be." He laughed and pulled her close again, and held her there in the kitchen while the fire burned down and the cold November wind moved around the house without finding a way in. December arrived, and with it the news from Mr. Graves that the debt had been settled, the creditor satisfied, and the new lease agreement ready for signature. Jasper rode to town on a clear, cold morning and signed the papers, which were not merely a lease now but a more complex arrangement. A long-term lease at revised terms, with a formal option allowing him to purchase a defined portion of the property, the northeast section, 50 acres of good pasture land, at fair market value within a period of 5 years, should he choose to exercise it. He chose, while he was at it, to visit the jeweler in Caldwell. It was a small establishment run by a man named August Keel, who had been in the county 20 years, and who had a case of rings that ranged from the practical to the surprisingly fine. Jasper stood at the case for a long time, because he was not entirely sure whether he was thinking about this too fast, and whether Delia would think he was thinking about it too fast. He bought a ring. It was a plain gold band with a small garnet set into it, the color of the live oak leaves in October, he thought, which was probably too romantic a justification but which he held onto anyway. He did not ask her that day. He carried the ring in his coat pocket for 11 days, which was long enough to be sure he was not rushing, And also, he would acknowledge to himself later, long enough for the anticipation to reach a nearly unbearable intensity. He asked her on a Saturday afternoon in December on the South Ridge, where the view was everything he had described to her. They had ridden up there because she had asked to see the sunset from that spot again, and they were standing together watching the last of the light do its business with the hills when he turned to her. "I have something to ask you," he said. She turned from the view and looked at him, and he saw in her eyes that she already knew what it was going to be, and that the knowledge was making her very still in a way that was not reluctance but something like careful joy. He took out the ring. "I am asking you to be my wife," he said. "Not because of this land, though I would be proud to build a life on it alongside you. Not because it is the practical thing, though I believe it is, in the best possible way. I am asking because you are the finest person I have ever had the good fortune to have standing next to me in the morning light, and because the idea of going forward in the world without you is something I genuinely cannot stomach." He paused. "I am asking because I love you, Delia. It is the honest statement and the whole one." She looked at the ring, she looked at him. The sun was going down behind the western hills, and the sky was doing the purple and orange thing that the sky in this country does when it is at its best. "Yes," she said. It was not a hesitant yes or a qualified yes. It was a complete and certain yes, said in the tone of a woman who has made a decision and is fully at peace with it. He put the ring on her finger. She looked at it in the fading light, at the small garnet catching the last of the sunset. "It is the color of the leaves," she said. "In October, when I first arrived, I noticed," he said. She looked at him, and whatever composure she usually maintained around her real feelings gave way entirely then, and the joy in her face was something he knew he would carry for the rest of his life. He kissed her on the South Ridge while the Texas evening came down around them, and the cattle moved below in the pasture, and the windmill turned slowly above the stock tank, and somewhere in the live oaks a bird sang a few notes and then went quiet. They were married on a Saturday in late January of 1884 in the small Methodist church in Caldwell, with Hector Beale standing up as Jasper's witness and wearing his best vest and an expression of profound satisfaction. Mrs. Farrow came and cried at a volume and duration that surprised everyone, including herself. Chester Graves attended as Delia's representative, since she had no family remaining, and he sat in the front pew with his gray mustache and his professionally maintained composure, and was observed by Hector to have very bright eyes during the ceremony. Jasper's three ranch hands, Hank, Cobb, and young Pete, who was 18 and who had been utterly convinced that his employer had gone soft, and now felt himself vindicated, occupied an entire pew and applauded too loudly at the end, which was not strictly appropriate, but which Delia received with the real laugh that Jasper loved. He had bought a proper suit in San Antonio, which Delia had not known about, and when she saw him at the front of the church in it, she had stopped in the doorway for a moment with an expression that he would think about for years afterward. She wore a pale gray dress, not white, because she was practical about what was sensible to wear in a ranch household afterward, with small pearl buttons at the cuffs and a collar of fine cream lace that had been her mother's. She carried winter wildflowers, purple and white, that Hank had found along the creek that morning and brought to her shyly, holding them out at arm's length as though afraid they might not be good enough, and she had taken them and called them perfect and meant it. When the minister asked if Jasper Sullivan took this woman to be his lawfully wedded wife, he said yes with a directness and a warmth that was not lost on anyone in that small church. When the minister asked the same of Delia, she said "I do" in her low, even voice and looked at Jasper steadily, and the steadiness of that look meant everything it was meant to mean. They rode back to the ranch as husband and wife in the early afternoon, and Hector had, without any instruction and presumably out of pure culinary sentiment, cooked an extraordinary meal and set the table with the good cloth, and the lamp turned up high. It was not a formal affair. Hank played the fiddle on the porch after supper, and Pete danced badly with Mrs. Farrow, who laughed at his footwork and showed him the steps twice. Graves drank one glass of whiskey with more evident pleasure than he had shown all day, and then said his good nights, and rode back to town, where he was staying the night before heading south in the morning. The ranch was quiet eventually, and they were alone in the house that had been Jasper's for 6 years and that was now, in every sense that mattered, theirs. "Well," Jasper said, from the doorway of the front room. "Well," Delia agreed, from the chair by the window where the stars were coming out over the south ridge. He went to her and pulled her up from the chair and held her, right there in the starlit front room of the house they were going to build their life in. She put her arms around him and her face against his shoulder, and he felt her exhale, long and slow, as though she had been holding something for a long time and was only now fully setting it down. "I want to tell you something," she said against his shoulder. "Tell me. When I was on that wagon riding out here in October, I was not in a good way internally. Edmund had been gone 8 months, and I had been managing the estate business and the grief and the uncertainty about what to do with this place, and I was tired in a way that I could not quite explain to anyone." She paused. "I had not told myself a hopeful thing in quite some time." He said nothing. He held her. And then this ranch came into view over the last rise, and the cattle were in the east pasture and the windmill was turning and the house had, she stopped. The house had curtains, which sounds like nothing. But it meant someone had taken care. It meant there was a person here who thought a house should have curtains. She tilted her head up to look at him. That was the first hopeful thing. He thought about those curtains. He thought about how many times he had pulled them down and replaced them and never quite understood why he bothered, only that he did. "I should tell Mrs. Farrow," he said. "She sewed the last set, twice." Delia laughed. "You can tell her later." He kissed his wife in the starlit front room of their ranch house, and they were very happy. And the happiness was not the easy, unconsidered kind, but the kind that had been earned and examined and chosen. Spring came early and warm to the hill country in 1884. The grass greened up along the creek bottom in March, and the cattle came through the winter in good condition, and Jasper expanded the herd as he had planned, adding 60 head that he drove back from a sale in San Marcos with Hank and Cobb, while Pete stayed home to look after things. Delia had, in the meantime, made the house more thoroughly a home than it had ever been in Jasper's 6 years of occupying it. She was not a woman who decorated for decoration's sake. She was too practical for that, but she had a sense of what made a space feel lived in and loved, and she exercised it. She unpacked her books from the trunks and found a place for them. She hung the maps her father had made in the study alongside the property survey. She had Mrs. Farrow help her with a proper kitchen garden along the south wall of the house, exactly where Jasper had argued it should not go, and the drainage was, she informed him with great satisfaction in April, perfectly adequate. "I stand corrected," he said. "You do," she said. She had also, quietly and thoroughly, begun to understand the ranch's business. She had not interfered with it. It was Jasper's operation, and she was clear that she respected that, but she had wanted to understand it, and she learned quickly. Within a few months she was keeping the books with a precision that Jasper had never quite managed, and she had identified 2 places where he had been overpaying suppliers in town by enough that the annual savings, when she pointed them out to him, made him stare at the numbers for a full minute. "I was a school teacher," she reminded him. "Mathematics." "I will never argue with you about numbers again," he said. "You will," she said, "but you will lose." Roland Fitch made one more appearance in May, riding up to the gate with a revised offer that was substantially higher than the previous one. Jasper was at the house when he arrived this time. He stood beside Delia on the porch and listened to Fitch's new proposal. Delia listened to it fully, which was more courtesy than it deserved. "I appreciate you increasing the offer, Mr. Fitch," she said, "but my answer remains the same. This land is not for sale." Fitch looked at Jasper. "Sullivan, surely you can see the business sense." "I see it clearly," Jasper said. "The answer is no." Fitch looked at the two of them for a moment, at the way they were standing, easy and together, the way people stand when they are entirely certain of their ground, and something seemed to go out of his expression. The calculation that had always lived in his eyes shifted into something that might, in a generous interpretation, have been acknowledged defeat. "Good morning to you both," he said, and turned his horse and rode away. He never came back. They heard, some months later through the county grapevine that traveled reliably through the feed store and the post office, that Fitch's Cattle Company had overextended itself in 3 counties at once and was having difficulties, and that Fitch himself had moved his operations further west. The relief in the county was not small. Summer was full and hard and good, the working kind of summer that leaves you exhausted and satisfied at the end of every day. Jasper and his hands ran the cattle through the hot months with the efficiency that comes from years of knowing the land, and Delia managed the house and the books and the kitchen garden with the same efficiency. They worked long days, all of them, but there was an eveningness to the days that Jasper had not known before, a sense of someone at the center of things who kept everything from flying apart under the weight of heat and work and 100 small crises. In August, Delia told him she was expecting a child. She told him at the breakfast table matter-of-factly, because she was a matter-of-fact woman, but there was a brightness in her face that was not at all matter-of-fact, and that he felt in his chest like a bell being rung. He got up from the table and went around to her and held her face in his hands and looked at her, and she looked back at him with that brightness that was joy, clear and full. "A child," he said. "In February, I think," she said, "if my counting is right." He kissed her forehead and both her hands, and then her forehead again, which made her laugh and tell him to stop being excessive. He was not capable in that moment of being anything other than excessive. Hector, when told, produced a pie. It was unexplained but clearly celebratory and excellent. The autumn of 1884 came around and brought with it the first anniversary of the day Delia had rolled through the gate on old Clem Purdy's wagon. Jasper thought about that day in October often, the wagon, the curtains, the moment when she had said her name, and everything had rearranged itself. He told her about it one evening on the porch in the warm October dusk, while the first stars were coming out. "The moment you said your name," he said, "Talmadge, I heard it and I thought everything I believed about this situation had just changed. And then you asked for water and I was grateful to have something useful to do," she laughed. "You were not exactly flustered." "I was enormously flustered. I was simply flustered on the inside." "I noticed the flustered," she said. "I thought it was rather endearing." He looked at her in the porch light in her 3rd trimester now, with the particular gravity and warmth that had settled over her in the last months. She was more beautiful to him than she had ever been, which he would not have thought possible a year ago. "You knew right away," he said, "didn't you?" "Knew what?" "That it was going to be something between us." She was quiet for a moment in that way she had before saying something real. "I knew," she said carefully, "that you were not what I expected, and I knew that whatever I was going to feel about this place, it was going to be complicated by the fact of you." She glanced at him sideways. "I did not know it would be this, but I suspected it would be something." "Something," he said. "A considerable something," she said. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat in the porch dark while the stars finished arriving and the cattle made their quiet sounds out in the pasture, and the windmill turned above the stock tank, easy and unhurried, going nowhere. February brought cold and the baby together, arriving in a 4-day sequence of weather and preparation, and then the necessary long, attended evening with Mrs. Farrow present and competent and Jasper pacing the length of the front hall with a thoroughness that wore a visible track in his own mind if not in the floor itself. When Mrs. Farrow came to get him, he was still pacing. The baby was a boy. He lay on the bed in the lamplight, very small and very red and absolutely ferocious in his displeasure about the circumstances he had arrived into, and Delia held him with the focused, wonder-struck expression of someone encountering something entirely new and not having any adequate reference for it. Jasper sat beside her on the bed and looked at his son, and said nothing useful for a while, because he did not have useful language for what he was feeling. He had the sense that the world had just expanded, that it had added a dimension he had not accounted for, and that he was going to spend the rest of his life adjusting happily to the new size of things. "He is very loud," he finally said. "He is expressing himself clearly," Delia said, which was so entirely in character that he laughed out loud, and the baby, startled, briefly stopped crying to stare in the direction of the sound. They named him Edmund, for the man who had left them the land that had brought them to each other. It seemed right. Delia had cried a little when Jasper suggested it, which was one of the very few times he had seen her cry, and her crying had made him want to hold her for a long time, which he did. Edmund Sullivan grew through 1885, with the determined energy of a boy who intended to explore every inch of the world he had been born into. By October, he was pulling himself upright against the porch rail and looking out at the cattle pasture, with an expression of focused attention that Delia said was purely Jasper's, and that Jasper said was entirely her own. The ranch grew steadily through those years. Jasper exercised the option on the northeast section in the third year, buying 50 acres outright, which was a source of quiet satisfaction to both of them. Not because the ownership of 50 acres was transformative, but because it marked the crossing of a line, a transition from the man who had leased other men's land for years to a man who was, incrementally and by honest work, building something of his own. Something that was, in the fullest sense, shared. Young Pete had grown into a solid, capable hand and had taken on additional responsibilities. Hank had married a woman from town and brought her out to the ranch, and she and Delia had become, unexpectedly, close friends, the kind of friendship that is formed between two practical women who find that the other person does not require anything performative from them. Cobb had eventually moved on, heading west to try his luck in the cattle country out past the Pecos, and they had wished him well and hired on a new man named George, a quiet fellow from Louisiana who knew horses the way some people know music. Hector Beale stayed. He showed no signs of leaving ever, which was satisfactory to everyone. One evening in the late summer of 1886, when Edmund was a year and a half old and Delia was quietly certain that a second child was on the way, they were sitting together on the South Ridge at sunset, a habit they had kept, coming up here when they could, which was less often now than in those first months, but which they protected, and Jasper was watching the light do the purple and orange business with the hills and thinking about the whole shape of things. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Always," she said. 6 years I worked this land not knowing your name. Not knowing anything about you except that the lease check cleared every November. I built all of this, the herd, the fences, the windmill, all of it without ever thinking about the person whose name was on the deed." He paused. "I think about that sometimes, how close I was to this and how entirely I missed it." She was quiet for a moment, the way she was quiet when she was actually thinking about something. "We each missed it," she said. "I had a piece of paper with your name on it. Jasper Sullivan, lease payment received, annual renewal. You were a line in an attorney's file to me. I did not think about you either." She glanced at him. "And then I came over that last rise and the ranch came into view and the windmill was turning and I thought someone is taking care of this. Someone is here." "The curtains," he said. "The curtains," she agreed. "And then there you were in the morning sun asking if I was there about the cook's assistant position." He laughed, still somewhat pained by this. "I have thought about that more than you know. It is rather funny," she said, "when you look at it from the outside. It was not my finest moment." "It was perfectly fine," she said. "You were surprised. You acted with immediate decency. That is all anyone can ask." She looked at him with that direct, warm gaze, and the sunset was behind her and the light was very good. "And then you asked if I wanted water, and it was the most gracious thing anyone could have done." "Water," he said. "You were taking care," she said, "as you always do." He looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had appeared on a wagon and changed everything, who had brought with her a name and a deed and a grief and a courage and a laugh that came from somewhere genuine, who had stood on the same ridge with him, and said yes when he asked her the only question that had ever mattered. "I love you," he said. It was plainly said, the way she said things without ornament. "I know," she said. It was not dismissal or shorthand. It was full acknowledgment, warm and secure and certain. "I love you, Jasper, completely and without reservation." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they watched the Texas evening come down around them, the hills going from amber to purple to a deep and quiet blue, the first stars appearing one by one above the south ridge, the cattle moving below in the pasture with their slow and patient grace. The second child arrived in February of 1887, 2 years and a day after Edmund, which Delia said was simply good organization on the part of the universe. It was a girl this time, with her mother's dark hair and her father's serious gray eyes, and they named her Clara, for no more complicated reason than that it suited her from the first moment, and they both knew it immediately. Edmund was fascinated by his sister in the way of 2-year-olds, which is to say completely, and with absolutely no regard for her personal boundaries, and spent the first weeks of her life attempting to offer her various items she had no use for, including a smooth rock, a piece of fence wire that was removed from his hand with some urgency, and Hector's wooden spoon. Clara received all of these offerings with the equanimity of a child who had arrived knowing that the world was going to be what it was. The ranch in the late 1880s was a settled and prosperous place, which did not mean it was an easy one. The Texas cattle industry was going through its own upheavals. The great die-offs of the brutal winter of 1886 had not hit them as hard as some, partly because Jasper had read the weather signs and moved his herd to the protected lower pastures early, and partly because the ranch's particular geography gave it some natural shelter. But the hard years had thinned out many operations in the county and changed the complexion of the land around them, and they were aware of their own good fortune with the kind of sober gratitude that does not take things for granted. Delia had, by this point, become involved in the school in Caldwell. She had not planned to. She had her hands full with the ranch and the children and the books, but the school had been struggling without a qualified teacher, and when the need was clear and her abilities were applicable, she was not a woman who could see a problem and look away. She rode into town twice a week through the school year, which Jasper admired enormously, and which the children of Caldwell benefited from in ways that would take years to fully become visible, but that were already apparent in the changed atmosphere of the classroom. She had also, in this period, done something quietly remarkable. She had gone to Mr. Graves in San Antonio with a proposal to formalize and protect the property from future creditor claims, putting the deed into a proper trust structure. Graves had been impressed by the thoroughness of her preparation and had executed the arrangement, which meant that what Edmund had left her was now genuinely secure in a way that it had not been when she arrived. She had told Jasper about it after the fact, not because she was concealing it, but because she had wanted to present it as finished rather than hypothetical. "It means no more surprises," she said. "No more debts appearing from the past that threaten to take pieces of the land." He had looked at the documents she showed him and felt something that was partly relief and partly a deep admiration for the way she always thought several steps ahead, quietly and without drama. "You protected it," he said. "I protected ours," she said. That word ours was the truest thing. It was what they had built, piece by piece, out of a lease agreement and a wagon ride and a misunderstanding about a cook's assistant position and the honest, unadorned decision to keep being the best versions of themselves for each other. By 1889, Edmund was 4 and Clara was 2, and the ranch had 320 head of longhorn and 50 acres in Jasper's name, and 4,000 acres under a secure, long-term arrangement that served them both as well as any legal structure could. Jasper had built a new barn the previous year, larger and better built than the old one, with proper ventilation for the horses in summer and enough storage for twice the feed he currently needed, which was forward-thinking, because he intended to expand. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, they went back to the South Ridge at sunset, as they always did when they could. Edmund had come with them this time, riding in front of Jasper on the horse, very serious about the responsibility of helping to manage the reins. Clara was with Mrs. Farrow, who had taken on a more regular role at the ranch as the family grew and who received this arrangement as her permanent and rightful place in the world. They stood on the ridge while the sun went down, and Edmund pointed at every cow he could see in the pasture and named them, because he had given each of them names and expected everyone else to use them. "That one is Marshall," he said, pointing with great authority. "And that one is Buckwheat, and that big one there is General Persimmon." "General Persimmon," Delia said gravely. "Yes, I see him." "He is a good cow," Edmund said. "An excellent cow," Jasper agreed. Edmund nodded, satisfied that the cattle were in order, and turned his attention to the horizon. The sun went down behind the western hills, and the sky did the purple and orange business, as it always did when it was at its best. And Jasper looked at his wife standing in the sunset light with her son in front of her and her hand in his, and he thought about 6 years of not knowing she existed, and one wagon on a Tuesday morning, and a question about a cook's assistant that he would be gently teased about for the rest of his life. He thought about the lease papers, annual and routine, a transaction that had always seemed simply practical, and that had been, quietly, the thread that was going to tie his life to hers the whole time. He thought about Edmund Talmadge, a man he had never met, who had bought this land when he was young and who had described it in detail to a niece in San Antonio until she could see it in her mind, and who had left it to her, and in doing so had given her a path here. He thought about the curtains. He thought about water offered in a dry season. He thought about the way she had laughed at the card table in the cold kitchen, and the way she had stood on the porch to dismiss Roland Fitch with the serene finality of someone who did not need to raise her voice to be immovable. He thought about the ring with the garnet, and the church in Caldwell, and Hector's pier, and Mrs. Farrow crying, and the way she had said yes on this exact ridge in the last of the October light. He thought about all of it, and it added up to something that he did not have a single word for, but that was larger and more solid and more sustaining than anything he had imagined for his life on the morning 6 years ago, when he had first ridden through a gate with a lease paper in his saddlebag, and the cautious hope of a drifting cowboy who needed somewhere to put down roots. He had put them down. They had grown. And what had grown from them was beyond any calculation he had been capable of making. "Jasper," Delia said, "you are very quiet. I am thinking." "About what?" He looked at her in the last light. At the woman who owned this land and had chosen to share it with him, who had given him children and partnership and the daily extraordinary gift of her clear and honest mind and her real laugh and her direct gaze. "About how much I have," he said, "that I did not know I was going to have." She looked back at him, and the brightness in her eyes was not the sunset. "I know," she said quietly. "Me too." Edmund leaned back against his father and pointed at the darkening sky where the first star was coming out above the South Ridge. "Star," he said. "Yes," Jasper said. "First one." "You have to make a wish," Edmund said very seriously, because Mrs. Farrow had told him this and he considered it reliable information. Jasper looked at his wife. She was smiling at him with her whole face, unguarded and warm in the way she had learned, or perhaps given herself permission to be, in the safety of their life together. He looked at the first star over the Talmadge land, over their land. He made no wish. He had everything. The years went on as years do, busy and ordinary, and punctuated by the moments that turn out to matter more than the large dramatic events, the quiet suppers and the early mornings, and the particular quality of light on a particular ridge at a particular time of year. They worked, and they raised their children, and they kept the land with the same care that Jasper had always kept it, and that Delia had brought her own intelligence and precision to, and the land responded as good land does to people who attend to it well. A third child arrived in 1891, a boy named James after Delia's father, who was the surveyor who had walked her over Texas ground and taught her to read the lay of the land. James arrived with a loud and cheerful disposition that he maintained consistently, which delighted everyone including his brother Edmund, who had by now graduated from naming cattle to having strong opinions about horse breeding, and who took the role of older brother with characteristic seriousness. By the early 1890s, when the century was winding toward its close and the wild territory of Texas was becoming something else less raw, more settled, the great cattle drives winding down and the railroads threading the country closer together, the Talmadge Sullivan Ranch was a fixture in the county. Known for good stock, sound fences, a fair and steady operation, and a family that was plainly and genuinely happy, which was not as common a thing as it should have been and which people noticed. Hector Beale was 60-something by then, though he would not confirm the exact number, and had developed the status in the household of a beloved and permanent institution. He had opinions about everything, produced extraordinary food from simple materials, had never once been gentle about anyone's nonsense, and was adored by all three children to a degree that occasionally made Jasper feel mildly competitive, though he kept this to himself. Mrs. Farrow had become, in effect, a member of the family, and she and Delia had developed the kind of friendship that does not require a great deal of language because the understanding between them was already complete. She had been present for every child, every illness, every ordinary day, and she had watched the marriage of Jasper Sullivan and Delia Talmadge with the sustained satisfaction of someone who had recognized what it was early and had simply waited for the two of them to catch up. On a warm evening in the late summer of 1892, Jasper and Delia sat on the porch while the children were inside with Hector, who was conducting what he called a cooking lesson, and what the children experienced as an opportunity to make a great deal of mess with impunity. The sky over the South Ridge was doing the purple and orange thing that it always did at its best, and the cattle were in the east pasture, and the windmill turned above the stock tank, and the live oaks along the creek were full and dark green. "I keep thinking about something," Jasper said. "What?" "That first day, when you told me your name." "We have been over that day," she said, with the gentle amusement she reserved for his periodic returns to this subject. "I know, I keep thinking about how I did not know what I was leasing, not just the land. I was here for 6 years and I did not know what the whole thing was going to turn into." She looked at him sideways. "Are you saying you leased more than the land?" "I think the lease came with more than I understood at the time." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Edmund used to say that the best things in life arrive without an itemized list. You cannot know what you are getting until you are already in it." He sounds like he was a wise man. "He was when he remembered to be." She paused. "He would have liked you enormously. He had no patience for pretension and you have none. He valued people who worked hard and did not make speeches about it. He would have liked what you have done with his land." "Our land," Jasper said. She looked at him, and her expression was the warm and steady one, the full one, the one that he had been the recipient of for 8.5 years and that had not once lost its power to make him feel that everything in the world was fundamentally all right. "Our land," she agreed. The sound of a considerable crash came from inside, followed by Hector's voice, raised in the resigned exasperation of a man who had been volunteering for this for years and had no intention of stopping. "That will be James," Jasper said. "Almost certainly," Delia said. They sat for another moment in the evening air, the sound of children's voices and the old cook's grumbling commentary floating out to the porch, the stars beginning to come out above the South Ridge, the windmill turning, the cattle grazing. Then they got up together and went inside, into the noise and the light and the sprawling, abundant life that they had built from a lease agreement and a misunderstanding and two people who had, against all initial expectation, found in each other exactly what they had not known they were looking for. The house held them all easily, and the land stretched out around them in every direction, known and loved, full of the future. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in every way that counted, everything.